Under the glaring lights of American Forum's studio, millions of viewers who tuned in for the live broadcast couldn't have anticipated they were about to witness one of the most seismic political confrontations in recent American history. What was billed as a casual discussion about American identity and culture between former First Lady Michelle Obama and Karoline Leavitt, the young rising star of the MAGA movement, was destined to become a defining moment in the nation's ongoing ideological struggle. The tension was palpable from the moment both women appeared on stage. This wasn't going to be an ordinary panel discussion. It was shaping up to be a clash of political titans from vastly different Americas. If you're interested in understanding how political confrontations can reveal deeper truths about our nation's divide, stick with us until the end as we unpack this remarkable face-off, moment by moment. Michelle Obama emerged first, embodying the elegant composure that had endeared her to millions during her husband's administration. Dressed in a tasteful beige silk dress, her warm smile concealed a razor-sharp intellect. Democratic supporters stood in reverence, waving signs championing justice and equality. She acknowledged them with a gentle nod, settling into her position with the quiet confidence of established power. Then came Karoline Leavitt. With her flowing blonde hair and pristine white suit, she entered not as a political apprentice, but as a warrior. Her eyes, tempered like cold metal, revealed unwavering determination. In that instant, she wasn't a young politician learning from veterans. She was the embodiment of a rising generation, and she hadn't come to converse but to challenge. Laura Bennett, the veteran moderator, stood center stage, her voice ringing out like a bell, announcing an ideological battle. Welcome to American Forum, where opposing voices are heard and the big questions are asked. Tonight, we dive into the topics of culture and identity that are reshaping America's future. The first topic unleashed immediate fireworks: education, specifically gender education and individual rights. Michelle Obama spoke first, her voice warm and emotionally rich. America is strong because of its diversity. Over the years, I've met countless children who felt isolated because of their gender identity. Education isn't just about teaching math or literature, it's about teaching kindness and empathy toward peers, regardless of differences. We cannot build a great nation by pushing the vulnerable to the margins. Democratic applause thundered through the studio. Some were moved to tears. From the MAGA side came only frigid silence. Karoline didn't rush her response. She sat straight-backed, her eyes gleaming with steely determination. She let silence reign for several seconds, like a violinist stretching the emotional string of her audience. Then she stood, moving to center stage. The entire auditorium held its breath. "Mrs. Obama speaks of kindness," Karoline began, her voice not loud but each word cutting like a dagger. "Ask the mothers and fathers in Iowa or Georgia, who are working double shifts to support their families, if they feel kindness when their children come home crying because they were forced to choose gender identities in class. I met a father in Missouri who nearly collapsed because his 11-year-old son was pressured to select preferred pronouns in school. That's not kindness, that's imposition." A thunderous response erupted from the MAGA supporters. Some Democratic attendees lowered their heads, unable to meet the moment. Michelle's brow furrowed slightly, preparing to respond, but Karoline raised her hand, refusing to allow interruption. "You mention isolated children," her voice softened deceptively. "But why do you never mention children ridiculed by classmates for maintaining their parents' faith? Why isn't an Arizona football coach fired for not using new pronouns ever mentioned in your speeches? Who do you choose, Mrs. Obama, children or political activists?" The auditorium erupted. Signs reading "Parents First" were raised high. In that moment, Karoline had clearly seized control of the debate's emotional trajectory. If you're finding this political confrontation as revealing as millions of viewers did that night, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more crucial political analysis. Michelle took a deep breath, attempting to reclaim her composure. "Karoline, you're distorting reality. Education is about opening minds and building connections, not division. I've visited schools where students find strength and acceptance. We need a united society, not one that fears difference." Democratic applause followed but seemed diminished, drowning beneath the MAGA crowd chanting Karoline's name. With the precision of a skilled debater, Karoline smiled almost mockingly. "Opening minds?" she repeated. According to Pew Research, 65% of American parents want schools to teach math and science, not ideology. These parents aren't enemies, Mrs. Obama. They're directly raising our future generation. Do you stand with them, or with corporations pouring billions into promoting artificial awakening? The atmosphere grew suffocating. Michelle still stood there, her hand slightly gripping the podium, but her eyes showed signs of strain. Karoline remained unwavering, a tower refusing to crumble or bend. She hadn't merely come to speak. She'd come to intellectually duel. And in this opening exchange, she had completely dominated the battlefield. After Karoline's surprising and razor-sharp opening, the atmosphere at American Forum was compressed tight, awaiting the next wave in what was supposed to be a policy dialogue but had transformed into an uncompromising battle. The audience was witnessing a clash between two eras, two ways of thinking, two opposing symbols. Michelle Obama, representing traditional democratic values of tolerance and inspirational narrative, facing a new force. A young woman not from the old political class but equipped with enough reasoning and courage to shatter empty rhetoric. As the debate shifted to economics, familiar political territory but treacherous for any leader who had held office, Laura Bennett directed a question to Michelle. Many believe the economy under the Obama administration helped America recover from the financial crisis. How do you view that economic legacy? Michelle nodded slightly, her voice warming with a touch of pride. When Barack took office, the country was plunging into crisis. Millions lost homes, thousands of companies bankrupt, the labor market collapsed. But we made difficult decisions, stimulus packages and saving the auto industry, to protect people, not Wall Street. As a result, over 14 million jobs were created during our 2 terms. Unemployment halved, and America gradually recovered. The room fell silent for several seconds before applause erupted from Democratic supporters. Some even stood, raising signs that read, "Thank you, Obama." Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on which argument resonates most with you, Michelle's vision of recovery or Karoline's critique of it. Your perspective matters in this important conversation. Michelle smiled gently, her eyes turning to Karoline as if expecting acknowledgement. But Karoline didn't applaud. She didn't smile. She merely tilted her head slightly, her hand resting on the podium as if preparing to turn a page, not with applause, but with numbers, and, more importantly, with the indignation of millions of ordinary workers. Mrs. Obama just told a very touching story, Karoline began, her voice not cold this time but filled with biting irony. But there's something she didn't mention. How many of those 14 million jobs were part-time with wages insufficient to live on? How many families worked 2 or 3 jobs to pay health insurance premiums after Obamacare passed? She paused, scanning the audience, her eyes sweeping around like a judge seeking answers in the silence. Under the Obama administration, she continued, U.S. national debt increased by over $9 trillion, nearly doubling. That burden doesn't fall on political elites but on salespeople in Ohio, truck drivers in Tennessee, single mothers in Pennsylvania. They don't call that recovery, they call it abandonment. Sound erupted from the MAGA audience. A man stood abruptly, shouting, "She speaks for me!" And like a chain reaction, applause and cheers cascaded across the auditorium. Karoline didn't stop. She stepped closer to center stage, as if narrowing the spatial gap between herself and viewers. Her voice rang out with inner force. "I visited Nebraska last week and met a farming family selling their tractor to pay medical bills. When I asked what they thought about Obama, the father said, 'I used to hope, but now I only fear.' That's reality, not figures produced by White House advisors." Laura Bennett interrupted, trying to balance the stage. "But Karoline, you can't deny that the Dow Jones recovered strongly during Obama's presidency and consumer confidence increased." Karoline turned, nodding slightly like a seasoned politician. "Yes, stocks rose, but I ask you and Mrs. Obama, how many ordinary workers own stocks? Growth for whom? For the American people or for corporations backed by government?" The spotlight highlighted Karoline's face, emphasizing her sharp eyes and resolute expression. She wasn't merely offering opinions, she was telling real stories, touching real pain, and that made it impossible for viewers to turn away. As the economic segment concluded, Laura asked a simple question. What's most important for the U.S. economy in the next 5 years? Michelle answered, sustainability and inclusion. Karoline offered just 4 words, truth and results. One side presented a gentle message full of hope. The other side delivered decisive straightforwardness, like a knife cutting through layers of silk. And the audience, both in the studio and millions watching outside, began to clearly sense that this evening wasn't simply a conversation. It was the moment when the old order began to shake. If you're appreciating this deep dive into one of America's most revealing political confrontations, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that explores the complex realities of our political landscape. After 2 intense debate segments on education and economics, the American Forum studio had completely transformed its atmosphere. Even the most neutral audience members couldn't remain unmoved by the confrontation between Karoline Leavitt, representative of an uncompromising new generation, and Michelle Obama, living emblem of grace and progress in American politics. Moderator Laura Bennett, typically maintaining composure and balance, now couldn't hide her tension. She understood the next topic would transcend policy. It would touch hearts, emotions, and the fragile boundary between compassion and the collapse of a value system. She spoke evenly but cautiously. The next question is for both guests. Immigration policy. Can humanitarian concerns coexist with border security? Michelle Obama didn't hesitate. She stepped forward half a step, placing both hands on the podium, eyes looking directly into the camera, as if speaking to millions of Americans watching from afar. Immigration, she said, is the very soul of America. Most of our ancestors were immigrants. They came here with a dream of freedom and opportunity. I've met Honduran children in California, Somali children in Minnesota. All carry aspirations to become doctors, engineers, teachers. How can we turn our backs on them simply because of where they were born? As she finished, the Democratic section erupted with amens and emotional applause. Michelle was rekindling a message that once made America misty-eyed: humanitarian compassion without borders, the belief that everyone, regardless of origin, deserves a chance. But Karoline Leavitt didn't let emotion override reason this time. She remained silent for a long while, as if wanting everyone to feel the calm before the storm. Then she spoke slowly, each word like a hammer striking granite. Yes, America is a nation of immigrants, but not a nation of lawlessness. MAGA supporters immediately applauded like rolling thunder. We aren't against immigration. We're against illegal immigration and the silence of powerful people while American citizens pay the price. She reached into her vest pocket, removing a small photograph. She held it high before the cameras, and her voice lowered, carrying a restrained anger. This is Sarah Rup, a 21-year-old college graduate killed by an intoxicated illegal immigrant in Omaha, Nebraska. That person wasn't detained, wasn't prosecuted, but was pardoned. The atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze. Michelle stepped back half a step. Not from fear, but from something deeper, a sense of losing initiative in the debate. Karoline looked directly at her, eyes not hostile but determined, and sharp as a blade. I ask you, Mrs. Obama, while you're telling stories about immigrant children's dreams, who will tell the story of Sarah's stolen dream? The applause now wasn't scattered, it was an earthquake. Men and women, even students in the audience, half of America had found a voice representing them. They shouted, "Protect the border! No more victims! Justice for Sarah!" Time is running short in this analysis, but there's much more to unpack in this historic confrontation. If you want us to produce more in-depth political analysis like this, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications. Michelle tried maintaining composure, nodding to acknowledge the loss before responding. Sarah's story is tragic, but millions of legal immigrants also suffer because of an overburdened system and the hostility we sow. Imagine if we had a more humane, efficient, and fair system. Sarah might be alive, and thousands of families wouldn't have to live in shadows. Karoline didn't let that statement travel far. She countered with decisive tone. Humanity cannot be placed above law. Empathy cannot replace security. If we cannot control our borders, the American dream will cease to exist. It will become a prolonged nightmare for both Americans and immigrants trapped in a non-transparent system. She related another story about an Arizona family whose home was invaded by armed illegal immigrants. They received no apology from the government. They don't have inspirational ambassadors like you. They only have sleepless nights and lifelong fear. This was no longer about statistics. It was about blood, tears, and real pain. Karoline knew this. She didn't use emotion as a tool to embellish. She used it to testify to what many Americans had experienced but been ignored by mainstream media. Laura Bennett, for the first time in the program, hesitated before speaking. She felt like she was walking between two precipices, human compassion on one side, order and discipline on the other. With a noticeably quieter voice, she asked, "So what's the solution?" Michelle spoke of comprehensive reform, clearer citizenship paths, more humanitarian approaches, and investing in immigrant communities to help integration rather than isolation. Karoline, conversely, talked about border walls, expedited deportation, state police rights, and citizens' self-defense rights. But mostly, she spoke with truth, a truth not edited by biased media but relayed directly from citizens she met weekly. As the immigration segment closed, the studio lights gradually shifted from neutral to a more suffocating, darker tone. Not because of the lighting system, but from the pressure mounting against Michelle Obama. 3 debate segments had passed, and while she maintained composure, the initiative and argumentation had increasingly fallen to Karoline Leavitt, the young woman proving to America that age doesn't determine courage. Now, as Laura Bennett moved to the 4th topic, economic legacy and leadership responsibility, the auditorium wasn't a place for dialogue. It had become a courtroom where each word could slash at the honor of an entire administration. Laura raised her voice. Our next question, President Obama's legacy. In your view, was it an era of proud recovery or a series of failures hidden behind slogans? Michelle took a deep breath. This was familiar territory, where she'd spoken on hundreds of stages, where she was celebrated for moving stories about hope and inclusion. With determined eyes, she began. I clearly remember early 2009 when America faced the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Barack had to shoulder not only a collapsing economy, but also convince a panicked nation that things would improve. She discussed the auto industry rescue, tax cuts for 95% of working Americans, and millions of jobs created through economic stimulus packages. She spoke with the warm voice of a wife who had witnessed her husband agonizing each night over charts, reports, and the obsession with public trust. When Barack left the White House, Michelle concluded, unemployment was at 4.7%. The stock market had recovered strongly, and over 20 million people had health insurance for the first time in their lives. A portion of the audience applauded vigorously, but one undeniable truth couldn't be ignored: that enthusiasm no longer spread throughout the auditorium as before. It seemed confined to the left wing, where Democratic loyalists still tried to grasp something belonging to the past. Then Karoline stepped up, but this time she didn't stand still. She walked slowly across the stage, holding a large printed sheet displaying a GDP growth chart. I thank Mrs. Obama, she said, maintaining courtesy. But now is the time we look straight at the truth, not through an emotional lens, but through numbers that don't lie. She held up the chart. Average GDP growth under Obama was 1.8%, the lowest since World War II. During that same period, national debt rose from $10 trillion to nearly $20 trillion. And while major cities recovered, hundreds of rural towns fell into desperate conditions, jobless, hospitalless, and hopeless. She told the story of Jackson, Ohio, a town that once had 3 factories, but by late 2016 had only 1 remaining. People there don't need an autobiography. They need a job, a gas station that doesn't close at 7 p.m., and a reason to believe in tomorrow. Michelle frowned, interrupting for the first time in the program. But government can't solve every problem alone. We created the foundation. The responsibility of states and communities is to continue building. There's clearly so much more to this fascinating confrontation between 2 powerful women representing opposing visions for America. If you're finding value in this analysis, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone interested in understanding America's political divisions. Karoline turned back, not interrupting, but with eyes now brighter, more intense. What did you just say, Mrs. Obama? Government can't act alone, yet your husband's administration printed trillions of dollars for projects that couldn't create a single sustainable job? Solyndra? The 2009 stimulus? How many friendly businesses received money then disappeared like bubbles? Whispers rose. Some Democratic audience members shook their heads, but many neutral attendees began nodding slowly to one another. Karoline continued, her voice no longer questioning but declaring, you call it a legacy. Well, look at America after 8 years, more divided, poorer in rural areas, and drowning in uncertainty about the future. She turned to the main camera, speaking as if directly into the eyes of millions watching. You may love Barack Obama, that's your freedom. But don't let personal affection obscure the truth. Laura tried maintaining balance, asking, so what would be a worthy legacy according to you, Karoline? Karoline smiled, not aggressively but very calmly. A worthy legacy is when people don't have to choose between food and health insurance. When a girl in Appalachia doesn't abandon her college dream because there's no internet. When a father doesn't have to walk 5 miles to work because no gas stations operate in his town anymore. A young girl in the audience burst into tears. The camera panned to her face, holding a sign reading, "My town deserves attention too." Michelle saw this and said nothing more. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she recognized that an era had changed. The person facing her wasn't just a novice politician, but the voice of millions of forgotten people who had finally found someone to speak for them. Under the softened lights of American Forum, the final debate segment was no longer ordinary discourse. It had become a defining moment not just for Karoline Leavitt or Michelle Obama, but for the direction of a country divided by difficult choices, preserving legacy or redefining the future. No more clever slogans, no more cheers from the audience, only an extended silence remained, the silence of minds being shaken and hearts reconsidering their own beliefs. Laura Bennett, despite being a seasoned journalist, couldn't hide her emotion as she asked the final question. If you could say just one thing to America today, what would it be? Michelle tilted her head slightly, her hand gently squeezing the podium. She looked around the auditorium where she had once been honored as a symbol of progress and kindness, then raised her head, eyes bright with intensity. I would say that we, regardless of where we come from or what we believe in, are still part of the American family. And family isn't built on fear, doesn't grow through exclusion. Family grows from tolerance, empathy, and the desire to understand each other. I still believe that love, however fragile, is the last thing remaining when all reasoning crumbles. Applause rose from the left side of the auditorium. The applause wasn't as thunderous as before, but subdued, like a respectful gesture for a woman once trusted by millions. But something had changed. The authority that had been her strength now seemed like an overly familiar painting, no longer moving people as it once did. Then Karoline stepped forward. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stood there silently, letting all applause naturally fade away. The air seemed compressed. A young woman never having been First Lady, never having sat in the White House, yet holding the opportunity to redraw the map for a generation. Mrs. Obama speaks of family, Karoline began slowly but clearly. I agree, but what family can survive without protection? If we cannot keep every child, every mother, every father safe, then all love is just words. She raised her head, eyes seemingly drilling into the minds of listeners. I don't stand here to tell beautiful stories. I don't have memoirs or documentaries on Netflix, but I have hundreds of conversations weekly with forgotten citizens in Idaho, Ohio, at the southern border, in towns the media has never visited. If you're moved by this powerful clash of ideas and want to see more content that explores America's divided political landscape, now is the perfect time to subscribe to our channel and join our community of politically engaged viewers. Karoline told stories about an Arizona father selling his truck to pay hospital bills for his child, about a Montana teacher transferred for refusing to teach materials against his conscience, about an elderly woman in Virginia living in isolation after her neighborhood changed due to residential redistribution policies. Each story was small, but that smallness made it touch the deepest emotional veins of listeners. Barack Obama said that light is stronger than darkness, Karoline paused, but sometimes we need people brave enough to step into darkness, not to illuminate it but to pull others out. She needed no philosophy, no flowery words. She simply concluded with a statement that silenced the entire auditorium. Before we love, let's protect. Protect those who have been forgotten, marginalized by policies made in the name of love. Silently, no one applauded immediately. But then from the back of the auditorium, a middle-aged man stood up, then another, and another. Nobody shouted. They just stood in silence as a way to honor the truth that had just been spoken. An elderly man removed his old baseball cap and placed it over his chest. A young mother embraced her daughter, tears falling. Michelle Obama stood on the other side of the stage, not looking at Karoline with resentment. She nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. One era was closing, and a new generation was rising, carrying questions no one could ignore anymore. Backstage showed two contrasting images. Michelle entered the break room with a gentle smile but distant, contemplative eyes. She knew that tonight wasn't a defeat but a transition, an exclamation point for an era when faith had once been enough to guide. Karoline, meanwhile, wasn't jubilant or celebrating. She simply removed her microphone and walked through the long corridor where camera lights had turned off, but the eyes of everyone she passed glowed with belief. A working woman whispered, "You spoke for me." A veteran placed his hand on her shoulder. "It's been a long time since I felt represented." That night had no winners or losers. There was only truth spoken not through compromise or calculation, but through pure courage. And for America, sometimes just one person daring to say what no one wants to hear is enough to rewrite history. If this story touched your heart, if you believe truth needs to be spoken, please leave a like so more people can discover this. And don't forget to subscribe, to join us on our journey, to give voice to ordinary but extraordinary people. Thank you for listening, and for believing in an America that doesn't remain silent.